Hi, welcome to the North Carolina Aquarium at Fort Fisher. My name is Renee and I'm here today with my friend Casey, and today we're going on a hike near the aquarium to learn about ecosystems.
Thanks, Renee. I'm so happy to be here. The aquarium is one of my favorite places to visit. But before we get started, I have a question. What is an ecosystem?
An ecosystem is where living and non-living things interact together in an area.
Okay, I know what living things are, like plants and animals, but when you say non-living things, are you talking about ghosts? Because I am scared of ghosts.
No, silly. Non-living things in an ecosystem are things like sunlight, wind, air, and rocks.
Oh, I know what those are. All right, so how big is an ecosystem?
Ecosystems can be all sizes, from the size of a forest to a small pond, even the area underneath a large rock.
Wow, I've never thought of the space under a rock as being an ecosystem. So, what do we need for our hike?
Well, we need sunscreen to protect our skin, sunglasses to protect our eyes, insect repellent because the bugs can be bad where we're going on a hike. We also want a reusable water bottle so we can stay hydrated, comfortable clothes, and shoes that completely cover our feet.
Oh, so I'm guessing I might need to change my shoes then.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to wear those kind of shoes. You want shoes that you can get wet and muddy and are comfortable walking in.
Okay, I'll go change. All right, I'm ready to go on the hike.
Oh, those are much better. Let's go ahead to our next stop.
Great. So where are we now?
This is our back pond.
Wow, and what's special about this pond?
Well, this is an enclosed pond that actually was a man-made burrow pit that over time it's filled with water. A burrow pit is a pit in which construction material like sand is used at another location as fill.
So was this the burrow pit when the aquarium was being built?
Yes, and now is a habitat for many animals.
Wow, what kind of animals?
Well, we see a variety of birds, including ducks. We've seen foxes, possums, raccoons, deer. We've seen turtles, snakes, otters, and even alligators.
Alligators? Those are really cool reptiles, but I do not want to go swimming in a pond with alligators. So, where's our next stop?
Our next stop is the Maritime Forest.
Are we in the jungle now?
Not quite. This is a maritime forest.
A maritime forest? What's a maritime forest?
It's a habitat located near the salt marsh at Fort Fisher.
And what's a habitat?
Habitats are simply places where animals live, and a maritime forest is just like any other forest. It has trees, shrubs, vines, and wildflowers. What makes it special is that it's growing so close to the ocean. It also closely resembles the woodlands that Native Americans lived in and colonists settled in over 100 years ago.
Wow. So how are the plants in the maritime forest different than plants in other forests?
Well, some of the common plants that you might find in the maritime forest are live oaks, yaupon holly, and wax myrtle. Now, most of these plants cannot tolerate salt. Those that can grow really tall and they spread out to form this protective canopy.
So they protect the plants inside?
Yes, and animals. They provide shelter, food, and habitat for many types of wildlife. And the wildlife in turn provide nutrients to the plants. They also help transport the seeds of the plants as they travel from one area to the next.
Wow. So tell me about some of the plants in here. Like, what is this big tree?
Those are live oaks, and they're the largest tree in the maritime forest. They provide shade and protection against salt spray to the plants and animals that live around it. Their leaves have this thick, waxy substance that prevent excessive water loss.
Wow, that's really cool. Now, it kind of looks like they're growing sideways. What is that?
Well, you'll notice that most of the live oaks here have a windswept appearance, and that's because young leaves and stems are quickly killed by salt spray that are on the ocean side. The other side of the plant is not affected by the salt spray, so it continues to grow away from the ocean.
That's a really great adaptation. Now, what about this plant? I noticed that sometimes it has red berries on it.
That's correct. That is a yaupon holly, and it is a flowering shrub. Some of them will have red berries during the fall and winter. Now, these red berries are poisonous to people, but birds can eat them.
Oh, that's good to know. I won't eat the red berries. Now, I remember reading that Native Americans used to make the leaves for tea. Is that right?
Yes, they did. Colonists also used this for tea until less expensive imported teas became available.
Wow. And what about the other tree with the blue-gray berries?
Now that is a wax myrtle, and that is a small shrub.
So can you make tea out of those leaves?
No, but if you were to crush these leaves, you'll notice there's an aromatic oil, and the colonists use that as an insect repellent.
Ooh, we need to try that. I don't like using that bug spray that comes out of a can.
Let's go on to our next stop.
Oh, I love the beach, the sun, the sand, the ocean. This is one of my favorite places. But why can't we go play on those sand dunes?
Well, we don't want to walk on the dunes because we can harm them, and they protect us against storm surge and coastal flooding. Dunes are actually large mounds of sand that accumulate in an area out of reach of the sea. And they're constantly changing due to wind and wave action because of high tides and storms.
Now, tell me about the plants here on the sand dunes.
Well, plants that live on dunes have some special adaptations. For example, the sea oat is a plant that grows on top of the dune, and it actually traps sand to help form the dune. As the sand covers the plant will grow taller and its roots will grow deeper and start to spread outward. Eventually, the roots will form a protective net just underneath the surface of the sand, and this is what helps hold the dune together.
So, do the plants keep the sand in place forever?
Unfortunately, no. If there's a strong storm or a hurricane, the sand is quickly swept away. The roots of the sea oats are simply not strong enough to hold the sand together against the tremendous force of a storm.
Well, hopefully we don't have to worry about hurricanes anytime soon.
Let's go to our next stop.
Where are we now?
We are in the salt marsh.
Is the salt marsh the same as an estuary?
An estuary is where the river meets the sea. They're usually partially enclosed, and they have slow-moving currents. They're banked by low-lying lands that are covered in salt marshes. A salt marsh is a low, wet area that is flooded by salt water during high tide.
Now, I've heard that salt marshes are really important.
Yes. These salty wetlands support a variety of plants, which are producers, and animals, which are consumers.
Oh, it stinks out here in the salt marsh. What is that from?
Well, when these plants and animals die, bacteria and fungi, which are decomposers, will release the energy trapped in the tissues back into the salt marsh. And because the salt marsh are frequently submerged by the tides and contain a lot of decaying plant material, the oxygen levels can be really low. And this is a condition called hypoxia. Hypoxia is caused by the growth of bacteria, and that's what produces that rotten egg smell you're smelling.
Well, that's good. I'm glad I'm not the only one. So there's a lot of grass here in the salt marsh. What is this?
This is salt marsh cordgrass, or spartina, and it is able to grow in salty areas. It dominates North Carolina's salt marsh, and is a primary producer that creates its own food through photosynthesis, using sunlight as its energy source.
And what is its importance?
Well, this tall grass slows the flow of the water, and it traps sediment and plankton and other nutrients as the tide comes in. It provides food and habitat to a variety of animals, and it's also considered a nutrient bank because it's rarely eaten until it begins to decay.
What animals eat it?
Crabs and other animals will eat the decaying grasses, and what they don't consume, bacteria and fungi, will break down to its basic nutrient components. Now, these nutrients become suspended in the next tidal flood. In estuarine waters, there's tiny plants that are called phytoplankton, and phytoplankton bring in these nutrients. Well, there are also tiny animals called zooplankton, and the zooplankton will eat the phytoplankton. Zooplankton is the basic food source for small fish, which are eaten by larger fish, which are then eaten by larger animals like birds, such as the herons.
Hey, I know what this simple transfer of energy is called. It's called a food chain.
That's right. And when other birds and sea turtles and humans eat the same fish as the heron, then becomes a more complex food energy transfer called a food web.
So what other kind of animals live in the salt marsh?
There are a variety of animals that live here, including invertebrates like mud snails, blue crabs, and grass shrimp.
Now, invertebrates. those are animals without a backbone, right?
Yes, and there's lots of invertebrates that live in the salt marsh. There are also vertebrates.
Oh, and so vertebrates are animals with a backbone.
That's right. So animals like birds, such as herons and egrets. We also have fish like mummychugs, silver sides, and pinfish, mammals like deer and foxes, and there's also a reptile, a turtle, that lives its whole life in the salt marsh called a diamondback terrapin.
Now, the salt marsh seems like it's really important. I've actually noticed something else about the salt marsh.
And what is that?
It's very muddy. I seem to be stuck. How come the salt marsh is muddy and not sandy like the ocean floor?
In calm waters, tiny particles of silt will settle to the bottom, and salt marshes can only form in areas where they're protected from the fury of ocean waves. Salt marsh grasses in these low energy zones tend to further slow the flow of water, and there's all this decaying plant material called detritus, and that enriches this resulting muck on the bottom. Now, this salt marsh is in an area where freshwater and saltwater mix, and this mixing causes particles that would normally stay suspended in the water to settle out.
Oh, I think it's called brackish water when you have a mixture of salt and fresh, right?
That's correct.
So is the water always this low in the salt marsh?
Well, the water would rise and fall with the tide.
Now, do the tide patterns in the marsh match the patterns out in the outer ocean?
While the tide patterns are very similar, the tide times vary greatly. In our area, the tide rises and falls later in the salt marsh than it does in the outer ocean, and this time difference is influenced by the depth and the width of the connecting inlet.
Oh, so do the plants here, can they have fresh water like other plants, or do they have special adaptations to tolerate some of the salt in the brackish water?
Only a few higher plants have adapted to living in salt water. Grasses like Spartina are able to excrete salt, forming crystals on their blades. These salt crystals are especially noticeable on extremely hot, dry days. There are other plants like the marsh elder that has these thick, fleshy leaves that contain fresh water, and this helps to reduce the salt concentration in the plant.
Wow, that's a really cool adaptation. It's kind of like when we sweat on a hot day. Now, what about the animals? Do they have special adaptations?
Well, changing tide levels can greatly affect the behavior and anatomy of salt marsh animals. So animals like the periwinkle, which is a type of marsh snail that breathes air, you'll notice they'll climb up the grasses to avoid the rising water during high tide. There's clams and mussels that will dig deeper into the marsh mud so that they don't become exposed during low tide. Then there's fiddler crabs that have gills, and they can remain out of water as long as their gills remain wet.
Wow, the salt marsh seems like a really important place for these animals.
It is, but not only is it important for the animals that live there all of their lives, it's important to animals that live part of their lives in the salt marsh.
Wow, why is it important for those animals that don't live here their entire life?
Well, the salt marsh provides calm water, food, and shelter. That makes it the perfect nursery for many ocean birds, fish, and shellfish. Then some of these animals become food for other animals in a complex food web.
So, is the salt marsh important for people in any way?
Absolutely. 90% of our saltwater fish and shellfish that we eat, including shrimp, clams, oysters, and flounder, live all or part of their lives in the salt marsh.
I love seafood. The salt marsh sounds like it's important to my tummy. But what about in other ways? How's it important to people?
Well, the salt marsh also acts as a buffer zone against extremely high tides and ocean storms. Its silty bottom and deep tidal creeks help trap water that the ocean would otherwise push inland, destroying homes and property. It also acts as a natural filter to remove sediment and pollutants from the water.
Wow, so not only is it important because it provides us food, but protection as well. That's amazing. What can we do to make sure we are protecting the salt marsh?
I'm so glad you asked. It takes everyone, not just people living on the coast. We can all do our part, no matter where we live, by not littering. If you litter or you use chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers, they can travel down storm drains, which lead to the creeks and rivers, which will end up in salt marshes and oceans. If we all do our part and put our waste in the right place and only use safe amounts of outdoor chemicals, we can keep the salt marsh safe and clean for all the animals and plants that call it home.
Wow, Renee, those are some great tips. I can definitely work to do my part. Thank you so much for showing me the salt marsh and the many habitats on our hike today. I had so much fun.
Thanks for coming.